Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Today is the 10th of July 2024 and we're in the South Parks of Oxford University. I'm in conversation with Jvala Singh, Jasdeep Singh, Resham Singh, Jeevanpal Singh and Mandeep Singh, and I'm Nihal Singh, and we're discussing Virasati Asthan Seva's new project, which is to conserve Haveli Kavi Santokh Singh, and with regards to that we're going to discuss Kavi Ji's work and its significance.
So before we go into the discussion, it's a tradition in our parampara to have some kind of Mangal. So you've given the introduction Mangal, and now we're going to do a little brief Mangal, which is from the Likat of Kavi Santokh Singh Ji, which Jeevanpal Singh ne aram karni hegi hai.
Vaheguru Sahib Ji, Sri Nanak
Pad Pankaj Bandhan, Pad Pankaj Bandhan,
Simaro
Angad Dukh Nikandana,
Amar
Das Hirday Nit Dhyavo, Hirday Nit Dhyavo,
Sri Guru
Ramdas Gun Gavo,
Sri Arjana
Bignan ke Nasak, Bignan ke Nasak, Har Gobind Subh Sumat Parkasak,
Sri Har
Rai Namo Kar Jori, Namo Kar Jori,
Sri Har
Krishna Manai Bahori,
Guru Teg
Bahadur Param Kirpala, Param Kirpala,
Sri Guru
Gobind Singh Visala,
Taru Tara
Kar Pun Pun Sisa, Pun Pun Sisa,
Bando Bar
Bar Jagdisa,
जिसमें है अमृत ज्ञान है माणिक भक्त विराग गुरु ग्रंथ साहिब उदद
बंदो कर अनुराग,
गुरु ग्रंथ साहिब उदद
बंदो कर अनुराग। वाहिगुरु जी का खालसा, वाहिगुरु जी की फतेह।
By way of introduction, would you speak about Kavi Santokh Singh? Who is he and what is his significance within Gursikh tradition overall?
Yeah, Kavi Santokh Singh was born at the end of the 1700s, and he becomes basically the most important historian, commentator on Gurbani, and he's known as Kavi, a poet, because he wrote his historical narrative, Suraj Parkash, in poetic form. And basically, since he began writing, he became, such a famous poet that his works basically became the gold standard for understanding Sikh history and understanding Sikh philosophy. So he was trained in Amritsar under the Gyaniya Bunga, or the institution related to the Gyanis, and this is associated with Bhai Mani Singh and his institution that he started there in Amritsar. And he becomes basically their most famous student, and he's continued to be read today, and his works are essentially the gold standard for Sikh history and philosophy.
And how did you first develop an interest in the poetry of Kavi Santokh Singh?
So Santokh Singh's works, the Suraj Parkash, which is a text related to Guru Nanak, to Guru Gobind Singh. It's basically the entire Sikh history of the Gurus. That text, when he wrote it in the early 19th century, it began to be recited across the major gurdwaras in Punjab and across, right? So how I got interested in it is that there was this tradition of doing katha of Suraj Parkash. And that continues to today, where people in gurdwaras, not only in India but in the diaspora as well, are doing katha of the text, doing discourse or exegesis, explaining the text. Because, as I mentioned, it's written in poetic meter, so somebody would recite the text, the poetry, and then somebody would explain it, right? Or one person would do it. And so basically my introduction to the text was, hearing that katha. You can find that recorded online, the entirety of the text. This text is, when you combine it with the Nanak Prakash sections related to Guru Nanak, this is like essentially 60,000 verses. It's a massive text. It is the biggest Sikh work ever written. So basically you would have ladivar, you would have continuous, almost everyday katha of the text at the gurdwaras in India, and you have that here in the diaspora as well. So most people might have heard that at the gurdwara, this type of katha. I heard it online, and when I heard it, I was addicted, because the way that Santokh Singh is writing these stories, right, it's just so compelling, and it's written in a format where you can enjoy it basically every day. So each chapter is essentially, if you're doing katha of it, it could take half an hour, it could take 45 minutes. So there was a tradition where you would do katha of this either in the late afternoon or evening time. And this was a tradition that, Kavi Singh would encounter as well. So Kavi Singh, one of the most famous writers of the 20th century, his father was famous for doing katha of Suraj in the late evening. And basically everybody in that area would come around and sit down and listen to his father, Charan Singh, do this katha. And now you can find this katha online. Basically, so many kathavachaks, so people who do discourse, have recorded katha of Suraj, and we have some Gyanis here who do katha of Nanak Prakash Santokh Singh's writings as well. And yeah, so that was my introduction to the text.
You've mentioned Suraj Parkash. Generally, what are Kavi Santokh Singh's best known works? And are there any that you feel should be more widely known than there are?
So Suraj Parkash, as I mentioned, that's the historical narrative, the stories of Guru Nanak to Guru Gobind Singh. Santokh Singh, before he wrote that, he wrote some other texts as well. So, as I mentioned, he was not only a historian. So Suraj Parkash is basically, he's assembling all of the historical texts from the 18th century, and he's curating them in this manner, and this is what makes Santokh Singh so important to Sikh Parampara, is that he's not only just assembling all the texts from the 18th century and then just putting them in order, but he's curating them in a style that had basically never been done before. He's writing a Mahakavya, he's writing this epic text, right, that is structured in such a way that it's just meant to be read almost every day. So each chapter is about equal size, 40 to 60 verses. There's parts of Nanak Prakash that are not like that, but the majority of Suraj Parkash is just meant to be consumed every day. And then you have this daily kind of engagement with the stories of the Gurus. And you'll see that like at the end of each chapter, sometimes it's a cliffhanger. So like the next chapter you're waiting for, you go back to it the next day. And the way that Santokh Singh is then weaving these stories across this massive text is really important as well, because he'll like foreshadow here, or he'll really spend time in character development, kind of building certain characters up in relation to the Guru as well. So that text is his most famous work, and that type of text had never been written before. That's why Santokh Singh is so important. And it has never been written since, actually, as well, since that time. Many people have taken his work and then basically remixed it. They've created briefs of that text, and most of the famous Sikh authors have done that, including Kavi Singh and his father and other writers as well, Nihal Singh, etc. So that is his most famous work, and that's why he's so important to Sikh Parampara. But he has many other works as well, including a commentary on Japji Sahib, Guru Nanak's most famous composition. And that commentary is published. There are works of Santokh Singh which are not published, but I feel like that is something for me who's interested in hermeneutics, understanding how to interpret Gurbani. That is just such a gem, especially because he's looking at the text and he's providing a commentary in a way that had never been done before as well, basically in a way that he's kind of outlining all the poetic devices that the Guru is employing, showing kind of how great a poet Guru Nanak was as well. Guru Nanak himself calls himself a poet in his writings, but that type of exploration could only be done by a master poet. So you really get to see both Santokh Singh's mastery of poetics and his understanding of poetics, and showing how the Guru was just so subtle in his construction of their poetics, their Gurbani. But you also see, if you do a close reading of the text, you get to see how Santokh Singh learned, about Gurbani and about history as well, because he mentions within that text, I've heard these meanings of Gurbani from the Gyanis of Amritsar, basically from the core, the heart of the Sikh tradition of that early 19th century or the early 18th century or late 1700s
century.
Yes, or early 1800s. So that is a work that I'm personally really interested in, and I don't feel like a lot of people have kind of engaged with that work, partially due to the complexity of the work. It is a very sophisticated work. But those are kind of Santokh Singh's two most famous works. There's another work which is not published, which is in the process of being edited and published, is Santokh Singh's version of the Ramayana as well. So he did a version of the Ramayana, and that's really interesting because when you look at that, and I've just skimmed manuscript versions of that, Santokh Singh's just prem of the Gurus, his love for the Gurus is just exploding out, because even while he's talking about the story of Ramchandra going to defeat the demon Ravana, even in that, just randomly he'll be talking about the Gurus and praising the Gurus, and he'll have certain invocations at the beginning of chapters, Guru Gobind Singh Judh ki chadai, like his kind of mounting up into the battle, totally random, but for Santokh Singh, he would just had all of that passion in him, and it was just, bursting out from him. So that is a really interesting type of retelling that I think would shed light on how Sikhs are also engaging in retelling. So these are just a few of his works. He's written other works as well. A Sanskrit dictionary, he wrote that into Braj, and he did that actually. This is a very famous Sanskrit dictionary called Amar Kosh. This has also been put into the vernacular in Guru Gobind Singh's court as well. But the way he did it is, he wrote a dictionary in poetic meter. So this really fascinating way of writing a dictionary, and just again shows you how proficient he is in poetics. And then to cycle back, that's why the Suraj Parkash, his main text, is so powerful, is not only that he's kind of using all the history that we have from the 18th century, 1700s, but he's also just writing in such a captivating way that it's not, it wouldn't be incorrect for me to say that I think he's the most proficient, the most extraordinary poet the Sikh community has ever seen. If we exclude the Gurus from that, for respect, I think, out of Sikh poets, he's by far the top. That's why he's called the Mahakavi, or Chudamani, the crown jewel of poets within the community.
You've referenced the genre of Mahakavya. More generally, how would you situate Kavi Santokh Singh within his wider literary culture, and how did he relate to earlier writings, earlier poetic creations?
Yeah, so in terms of Mahakavya in the Sikh community, for that type of construction related to the Gurus, that had never been done before. You do have texts that talk about from Guru Nanak, the history to Guru Gobind Singh. They're really short though, they're very brief, right? You have Bansavi Nama, Mema Prakash does that as well. But they're not written in the Mahakavya form. Santokh Singh, what he does in relation to the literature that comes before him, he collects all of that literature, from the writings associated with Mani Singh, the Janam Sakhi literature prior to that as well, the Gurbalas literature. He collects all of that together, and he's very careful in curating that information into a single narrative, right? And that had never been done before. And only somebody who's that good at poetics and storytelling could do such a thing, I think. And the way he's done it is just unparalleled. And that's why people have made briefs after him, have to look at that text, like Nihal Singh, I mentioned, Kavi Singh, have done summaries of that, but nobody has been able to construct something so massive. 40 years after he makes this work, you have people like Baba Samir Singh of Patna, these are like legends at the time of the late 19th century, who would say that Santokh Singh has basically made a vessel of praise of the Gurus which is going to liberate all the Singhs, right? Because itihas for the community, history or historical narratives, since the time of Guru Angad Dev Ji, they're really important. You know, not only is Gurbani important to the Sikh community, but also understanding the history of the Gurus. So after Guru Nanak Dev Ji passes, Guru Angad Dev Ji basically commissions an account, history. This is where the Janam Sakhi tradition comes out of. You know, trying to understand, trying to put together the history of the Gurus. And not just the history that's saying, okay, the weather on the day that Guru Nanak was born was like this, but they're actually relating that to the Gurbani as well. What is the historical where did Guru Nanak recite his arti? What was the discussion between that, right? So that also shows historical context for Gurbani, helps you understand Gurbani. And also you get a sense of the personality of the Gurus in that discussion. And also you get kind of a relationship begins to form with you, the reader, who's listening to these stories of the Gurus and the Gurus, right? So you get that relationship, and that, for many Gyanis, they say, basically the first party, the first step into Sikhi is itihas, is historical understandings of the Gurus. Because then you build that relationship with the Guru. Without that, why bother reading Gurbani, right? So even within Santokh Singh's works, at the end of certain chapters, you have these Phal Shruti. It's basically meaning the result, the reward of reading this text. Santokh Singh, he's talking about the Gurus, but he says those people that engage with these stories of the Gurus will then be able to focus, will have a loving relationship with Gurbani as well, right? So that they will be able to kind of enjoy that taste, that ras of Gurbani, right? So there's a connection between understanding the history of the Gurus and understanding Gurbani. So Santokh Singh is cognizant of that when he's looking at the historical record of the 18th century, and he basically puts them all together and he weaves it into this beautiful tapestry that essentially, I mean, we still have today, and people spend their lives studying that today as well. So that's, I guess, his relationship with the previous works.
Then finally, just since one sometimes does have a tension, especially as these categories are understood in the West, between poetry and history, or poetry and philosophy, we can certainly speak of the devotional significance of Kavi Santokh Singh. We can speak of the literary significance. In terms of the writing of Sikh historiography, how would you place his significance?
It's a great question. It's a great question, which was not on the draft. So, but it was a brilliant question. You know, since the late 19th century, there was not this division between writing history in poetic meter versus just prose, right? You would have the early Janam Sakhis were written not in poetic meter, but they were still engaged in forms of storytelling, which, let's say, the historical discipline of the West from the 19th century onward would feel that would fall outside of the bounds of what a historical text is, right? So notions of history during the pre-colonial time were quite different than what comes later. But the Suraj Parkash specifically is really important because it comes at the cusp of colonial advent, kind of this arrival of the British into Punjab, right? There's an anxiety about the British for sure. They're next door, right, when Santokh Singh is writing this text. But in the mode in which he's writing the text really represents, I think, the best of pre-colonial modes of storytelling, right? And those modes of storytelling, I mean, this is why we still have the text today. I think they last the test of time. They're so engaging. You get caught up in the stories. Whereas when you compare that with, let's say, a historical textbook from the 20th century, honestly, it doesn't capture you. You know, you're talking about just, this happened and that happened, that happened. So Santokh Singh, when he's writing these stories, he's really trying to get you emotionally connected and involved in these stories. And you find yourself then just thinking about the stories and relating the stories to everyday life, because not only are they talking about, okay, the Guru was born on X date and this event happened on 1699, etc., but you actually get to see the interaction of the Gurus with their family. You get to see how they are interacting with the community even prior to receiving the title of Guru. You get this sense of the personality, and you get this sense of how Sikhi then plays out in like the real modern landscape, right? In terms of family, community, society, etc. So it becomes much more, there's so much depth to these types of texts, which you don't get in the later type of forms of history, let's say written in the 20th century, right? So that's kind of the difference between storytelling prior to the British and then after. So when the British come in, basically Sikhs then take to British forms or colonial forms of historical writing, and even so they leave the poetic behind. So this is a difference, that in the 20th century, poetics was associated with, I mean, this is a long-standing debate even in Greece, etc., that poetics was naturally going to, let's say, they're not going to present the objective facts, right? They're going to elaborate, they're going to include, let's say, things that tie emotion in, and that then is subjective, that's not objective. They're going to present basically things that are not true. But prior to this, and even in the Janam Sakhi tradition, prior to the Gurublas tradition, etc., prior to Suraj Parkash, you still had modes of storytelling which were quite different, and that were engaging with mythic stories, engaging with Puranic references, and Gurbani does the same thing. So Santokh Singh is basically just following a tradition which soon comes to an end after Santokh Singh.
Well, coming to Kavi Santokh Singh's education, where did he obtain his vidya, and are there any particular centers of learning, any particular traditions that he's most associated with?
So, as I mentioned, Santokh Singh was born at the end of the 1700s. His father was actually quite a brilliant scholar himself. So when Santokh Singh was a young boy, he was learning off of his father first. And even as a young boy, he was very talented. He would be able to kind of respond in short couplets, dohas, or chopai meters, etc. So he had great potential as a poet. And then he was taken, because he had potential, to Amritsar. So he had family in Amritsar, and he was entrusted basically to the top Gyani in Amritsar. His name was Gyani Sant Singh. Gyani Sant Singh was part of a lineage called the Gyaniya Bunga. Now, Bunga means institution, or learning institution, or residence, really. And that Gyaniya Bunga was basically the residence of the Gyanis. So in Amritsar, since the time of Bhai Mani Singh, you had this lineage of Gyanis. Now, Mani Singh was the first, and he got his vidya, he's got his learning, in association with Guru Gobind Singh. So he was passing on that knowledge, and then that knowledge passed on eventually to Suraj Singh, who was Sant Singh's father, and then to Gyani Sant Singh. So Gyani Sant Singh, the most famous scholar in Amritsar at that time, he was Santokh Singh's teacher. So Santokh Singh spent many years there, learning poetics, learning Sanskrit, learning other texts. So Gyani Sant Singh was a proficient writer as well. So he wrote a commentary on the Ramacharita, this is a text on Tulsidas. So Santokh Singh spent his time there and learning, about commentaries, learning about Gurbani, and then learning about Itihas or history as well. So that's where Santokh Singh kind of cut his teeth. And then later on he traveled from here and there writing different texts, but that was mainly where he studied from.
Do you have any favorite passages from his corpus?
You can quote different Mangals and different kind of, verses, and you could find plenty of those online in English. But I think in terms of storytelling, unquestionably Santokh Singh is kind of the pinnacle of poets of our community. So his verses are incredible. But I think one thing that people maybe don't appreciate about Santokh Singh is when you compare his works with the previous works, and this kind of goes back to one question you had before, what he is able to do in kind of curating those works and making the text as Mahakavya, he's able to really expand on some of the both the Siddhanta kind of principles of Sikhi, but also the character development. And if I were to think of one that's most meaningful to me, I think it's Guru Hargobind's relationship with Bande Khan. This is essentially one of the baddest mercenaries of the region that Guru Hargobind hires. And so he's on payroll, and Guru Hargobind is vividly described partaking in martial traditions and kind of martial training, and Bande Khan's there. And you have these stories in other texts, even in Dabistan, kind of a contemporary account of the Sikh tradition. You have it in Gurbalas, but the way that Santokh Singh is able to, over the course of 250 or 300 chapters related to Guru Hargobind, paint this picture of slowly there's this great bond built between Guru Hargobind and his best warrior, Bande Khan. And over time, Santokh Singh knows how this is going to end. But during the course of that storytelling, he's showing how affectionate they are to each other, how much, prem they have for each other. And he's really able to then, build that up. And then it comes to, spoiler alert, they fight each other in the Battle of Kartarpur. Guru Hargobind basically cleaves them in half. And how, much that affects Guru Hargobind, nobody has told that story so emotionally like Santokh Singh has. And if you've kind of gone through that whole storyline, the character development, the foreshadowing, all of that, it's just, nobody can match Santokh Singh in doing that. And then you really think about the principles associated with the Guru, Patat Pavan, because at the end of that life, where Bande Khan has, done such atrocious things to the Sikh community and Guru Hargobind, bringing this army against Guru Hargobind, right? At that last moment when he's cut in half, and he basically says that, Guru Hargobind, your talwar now is what's gonna save me, essentially. Not any type of kalma or anything else, right? Guru Hargobind is so touched by that he's liberated. Bande Khan's liberated from that, right? And then you hear these terms about Patat Pavan or Garib Nawaz, and these kind of praises to the Guru, right? But you see that played out there, right there. So that's what makes Santokh Singh just unmatched in history.
Kavi Santokh Singh is still very much a living presence at many gurdwaras. To come to him in performance exegetically, Jivanpal Singh, would you talk to us about how it is that you began to engage in katha of Suraj Parkash and related texts? How did the tradition of katha begin more generally, and where might one hear it today?
So the tradition of katha itself, in the historical texts like Jvala Singh has touched on, the Janam Sakhis. So the Janam Sakhis themselves are supposed to be read out. When you read the Janam Sakhis, at the end of every section it says Bolo Ji Vaheguru, and that's engaging with the Sangat. So in a village, for example, we're sitting here in the circle, most likely under some tree in a village, in the middle of the village, the Sangat would come together at night and they go through, someone would read the Janam Sakhi, and then at the end of each sort of Sakhi, they will recite Vaheguru. So that sort of tradition of Katha, in a sense of talking about the lives of the Gurus, that's been there from the times of Guru Angad Dev. Katha itself, in terms of the Katha of Gurbani, we can see that the Gurus themselves did this, and in the Samprada, so the traditional lineages of learning Gurbani, Guru Gobind Singh Ji themselves does the Katha of Guru Granth Sahib Ji. When it comes to the Katha of Suraj Parkash, how did I get involved in that? Learning Katha itself, you usually start from these sort of small philosophical texts, Sar Kutavli, Vichar Mala, these sort of very small texts on different philosophy. And as you carry on learning Katha, you come to a point where you're introduced to Nanak Prakash. So in the Suraj Parkash, which covers Guru Nanak Dev Ji to Guru Gobind Singh Ji, Nanak Prakash is the first sort of part of that, which covers the life of Guru Nanak Dev Ji Maharaj. And that section, Jwala Singh will probably talk more about this, that was actually written before the sort of main section of Suraj Parkash, which covers Guru Angad Dev Ji to Guru Gobind Singh Ji. So Kavi Ji wrote this first, and he cites his reasons for writing this text, and he says mainly it was the sort of what would you say,
well, he sort of attributes it to the interference from other sects, so the Hindalis and people who have added in excerpts from their own tradition, usually to show Guru Nanak in a derogatory or lesser way. He states that two people get together, one from the Kabir Panthis and one from the Hindadlis. So Baba Hindal, without going into too much depth, was a great Gursikh of Guru Amar Das Ji's period, and one of his descendants, who Kavi Ji I think names generically as Niranjaniya, he gets together with the Kabir Panthi and he obtains what is called sort of like the Para Mokha Janam Sakhi. So Jvala Singh talked about the Janam Sakhi tradition, and that our narratives tell us that it was Guru Angad Dev Ji who sort of directed Sikhs who had seen Guru Nanak Dev Ji from the beginning to tell the stories, to narrate them to the Sangat, and then they were penned down by Para Mokha Ji. And Kavi Santokh Singh details that manuscript, or that Janam Sakhi, was eventually sort of interfered with by others, the Niranjaniya and so, to show their own ancestors, to show Bhagat Kabir in a light that was sort of superior to Guru Nanak Dev Ji. So Kavi Santokh Singh feels that even at his time, so nowadays you hear people saying, oh, Milavat, the things have been interfered with, but Kavi Santokh Singh is probably the first person, at least in written record, who says, yes, there has been Milavat, there has been adulteration of historical text, and if anything, he's trying to set the record straight. So Jvala Singh's already outlined how Kavi Ji took pre-existing sources, Bansavali Nama and Kesar Singh Chibber's work, and even oral histories. He travelled extensively collecting oral histories, so not things that weren't penned down. Even what's the name of that Malwa Desh written Pothi, that Pothi as well, the travels of Guru Tegh Bahadur and Guru Gobind Singh, Sikhandi Bhagatamala. So anything that was available, bearing in times this is pre-internet age obviously, he compiled, and then he sewed it into a narrative. And Jvala Singh's already mentioned how previous texts were sparse. You may have a paragraph on a Sakhi that gives you what you would say the Tatnachor, just the essence. Kavi Santokh Singh's brilliance is that he brings the Authentica context and brings a narrative together whereby you get the siksha, the teaching, the essence, which you can then reflect upon. You can see it because of how visual the description is, and you come away with a greater understanding of Sikh principles, Sikh ethos and Gurbani, depending on what's being discussed. So yeah, your question was about sort of where the Nanak Prakash came from, where Gatha came from. So Kavi Santokh Singh was identifying these sort of outside influences that were starting to change the narrative of the Sikhs, and sought to redress it with his magnum opus.
If I could just interject very quickly here,
Please.
Talking about Katha and Suraj Parkash, when Santokh Singh is writing the text, how he would write it, every morning he would look at his sources, he would compose it in the early afternoon with his scribes, and then in the evening, this is outlined by Bhai Veer Singh, in the evening he would go to the local Gurdwara there in Haryana, in Kathal, he would do Katha there in front of the Sangat of that chapter, and then sometimes you would have questions from the Sangat. And that, what Resham Singh was just talking about, that section comes up when a question occurs. And the Sangat asks, about the different Janam Sakhis. There's also a question about Raja Janak and the relationship with Guru Nanak. But occasionally within the text, he'll be talking about, the chapter, and then there'll be a Sangat question. And then he'll address it. So this shows that he was doing Katha as he was composing it. He would compose it, he would do Katha, Sangat, if they have a Shanka or, a doubt, or they want clarification, it will be talked about, and he'll address that later on. So since its inception, he would do Katha. His eldest son, Ajay Singh, he took one of the first manuscripts of the text, he took to Anandpur Sahib, and then he would do Katha for years there as well. So since its inception, people were doing Katha, and then Jeevan Pal Singh is continuing that tradition.
Fascinating.
So if I just, I kind of left my point in the middle. So when you go to learn Katha in a traditional school, that could be Nirmale, that could be the Textiles, any sort of traditional school, you do sort of go through this process, and eventually you end up where you start learning Nanak Prakash. And the one thing that I noticed personally in that learning of Nanak Prakash, why is it that we focus on Nanak Prakash specifically, and other sort of sections of Suraj Parkash? So those who are sort of lucky to spend many years learning from a Gyani, they would go through the whole of Suraj Parkash. So they would literally just listen to the Katha from the Gyani, their Ustad, their teacher, and they'd have a chance to ask questions, right? But someone who doesn't have that much time, usually you're just taught the Nanak Parkash, and then you're taught a section from the Panjvi Rot, which is in Guru Gobind Singh Ji's life, that sort of section of Suraj Parkash. And in Nanak Parkash itself, I found that many different things we need to understand Gurbani, or different philosophies. Like, we don't have time to go, not everyone's going to have time to go Kanchi to learn Nyaya, Shastra, to learn Vedant, to learn all these things. Kavi Santokh Singh Ji's packaged that all into Nanak Parkash. And even for the layman who's going to listen to this Katha, they're going to learn all these different philosophies just from Nanak Parkash. So, for example, where Guru Nanak Dev Ji goes to visit Raja Shivnab, and Raja Shivnab asks Guru Nanak Dev Ji about what is Yog and what is Hat Yog, and Guru Nanak Dev Ji Maharaj then explains what Hat Yog is, but Kavi Santokh Singh doesn't just leave that in a line that Guru Nanak Dev Ji explained it. He then explains in the whole chapter what is Hat Yog, and he goes through all of that. So as a student, then you learn that as well. And then you're able to present what are these philosophies that Guru Granth Sahib is talking about as well.
Just to add on to that, sorry if there's anything else. So Jvala Singh is talking about kind of theologically or philosophically, you get so much out of it. But, having taught language before, linguistically as well, the way that Santokh Singh is writing, in Braj Pasha, the language that you find in Dasam and Guru Granth Sahib as well, going through the text basically is like training to understand Guru Granth Sahib and Dasam as well. Because the language is the same, the vocab is the same, and this has been my experience, so I've understood that, when students are going through Suraj Parkash, because they have context clues, and that's really important for language learning, you have a narrative. You understand who's there, you understand the context, the environment. When you're looking at each line, it's all written in poetic meter, right? So each line you have to uncode the poetry, right? So as you go through, you're listening to the Katha. By listening to the Katha by somebody who's explaining it, you're already, even subconsciously, doing the reverse engineering of how to unpack that line. And then if you're consciously sitting there after, like a good student should, and trying to decode it, you are learning how to parse poetry, right? And that's what I found is such a benefit to me going through it as well, is that, having done however many episodes, you're going through, thousands of lines, right, of Braj poetry. And because you have those context tools, you're going through it basically with crutches, right? You have an aid in understanding poetry. And then when you look at the harder stuff like Ad and Dasam, then, you get a sense of what's going on there. I mean, it's much more difficult for sure, the Gurus are writing it, but you have such a good base because of that as well. So not only philosophically it's a learning, teaching tool, but linguistically for people in these sampradayas, these learning institutions, it becomes a teaching tool to understand language as well.
And I think that as well, like in terms of the syllabus of how someone learns in this traditional sampradaya, you learn the Nanak Parkash first. So you're not going straight to Ad and learning the Katha of Ad. That's the first thing you're going to encounter, and that's going to help you later on to understand these the main texts.
So from the outside, just to summarize this part of the conversation, it might seem surprising that in a relatively short period of time, Kavi Santokh Singh's writings become so central within Sikh pedagogy, what one actually gets in a Gurdwara. But then there are a lot of challenges. There is what's distinctive and unique about his work vis-a-vis what has come before within Sikh tradition. Then there's a way in which he's really drawing upon the tradition of the Gyanis, the tradition of the Janamsakhis. So in a way, it's a efflorescence of what's come before, ensuring that Sikh histories can't be any further mutilated. It's a sort of bastion that he's essentially erected, a bunga of its own.
The way I kind of see it, and it's only come apparent to me recently, is Kavi Santokh Singh is doing almost what Bhai Gurdas did a couple of hundred years earlier. Because if you read Bhai Gurdas Ji's Vana, you get a summary of Indic thought as it exists at that time. Some places it's brief, some places it's a bit deeper, but the role that Bhai Gurdas plays at that time, Kavi Ji then plays for us, after we've had the benefit of 10 Badshahiyaan are the full manifestation of the Guru Bani, because obviously Bhai Gurdas, his period finishes Guru Har Gobind's time. Kavi Santokh Singh then, in my opinion, almost takes that mantle and continues. Because as Bhai Jimpal and Bhai Jvala Singh have been saying, he gives you the length and breadth of Indic thought, contextualized then with Sikh thought, and when someone goes in deep, they can then peruse the differences and similarities that then prepares them for training, for going to the root of Sikh ethos, which is Ard and Das and Barni. So yeah, I think how you characterize it is very apt.
Then to come to Virasati Asthan Seva, it's a new charity registered in England and Wales, and we're discussing Kavi Santokh Singh, primarily because his Haveli is one of your new conservation projects. To talk about the charity overall, your website describes the organization as a charity dedicated to the preservation and conservation of sites of historical and architectural importance associated with the Sikh tradition. What convinced you that this work is necessary and viable?
I would say my sort of background is really more to do with book and paper conservation. That's my sort of training. As part of that, I helped to develop this charity called Poti Seva. And for many years, repairing historic Poti Sahibs, be they printed or in a manuscript form, be they Guru Bani or Guru Tahas, it was something which I tended to view as something which is like separate and distinct, to only focus on the books and manuscripts, not to think about too many other sorts of forms of Virsa, heritage, really. And then sort of over time, this, I would say, immature sort of understanding is sort of developed a little bit more, and I started to sort of see that all these different forms of Virsa, which in my brain were compartmentalized, can only really be understood together. And particularly with let's take a Poti Sahib, let's take a Poti of Shri Nanak Prakash. Unfortunately, as the case is now, most manuscripts, most Hatlikat Pothis of Shri Nanak Prakash or Suraj Parkash, you will tend to find them kept in academic institutions, universities, libraries, and places like that. The Sampradayas, be they sort of Gyani Sampradaya Taksals or Sevapanthi or Nirmale, they will mostly be using later sort of printed versions, occasionally using some earlier sort of printed versions, but mostly printed versions. And that I felt was something unfortunate, that these Hatlikats, to truly understand what their life was, you have to understand the context, yeah. And I would sort of, compare it a little bit like this. To truly understand like an animal, you have to see in its natural habitat. All these sort of Pothis, they had a life when they were used, which was the original context within a historic Sampradaya, and that Sampradaya in turn was sort of housed within a historic Asthan. So these historic Asthans, which most of my life I just saw as like buildings, maybe with some kind of memory attached to them, but mostly just a building, I then started to think of them as more like an overarching structure which housed these traditional lineages, sampradayas, where traditional Sikhi was practiced, and these Pothis which I was conserving were part of that life. And then you have to use a little bit of imagination. This is where I'll say, like talking earlier about the poetry versus history. History will tend to not enter the brain really. It's mostly looking at what bodies are doing, whereas poetry lets you, with imagination, enter the brain. So looking at these Pothis, I started to think, I wonder what Sant, what Sadhu, what Sikh, what Bibi, what Mai, what Sevadar was handling this, reading this, doing part, or as Bhaji and Jvala Singh was saying, was listening to this, maybe under a tree like this. And therefore this idea of Virasati Asthan Seva started to sort of develop. At the sort of a few years ago then, Bhaji Resham Singh got more into looking at wall paintings. which is a particular aspect of Afghanistan which like has been sort of singled out. And it was a particular set of paintings, a very famous set of paintings at Baba Atalai, which I think were, by Risham Singh, you can expand on it, how you got sort of into looking at those paintings.
Yeah, you've actually sparked a point that I was going to make later on, actually, because it's funny, because my journey into this was in 2019 we were gearing up for Guru Nanak Dev Ji's 550th anniversary of their manifestation, and I was in India the year before, and in my mind I'd been speaking to Jvala Singh about we should do something to mark this occasion. And initially I was fortunate because at that time renovation works were going on at Baba Atal Rai Gurdwara, which is the sort of 9-storied octagonal shaped Gurdwara just outside Harmandir Sahib, next to Khalsar. And I saw a Sevadar sitting there, and he saw me sort of taking an interest on the outside of the Gurdwara, and he said, "Do you want to go upstairs?" Because it was locked at that point. And I said, "Yeah." And we had our camera, and we just thought, okay. And I was in contact with Jvala Singh, and I thought, okay, why don't we take pictures of these? Because the frescoes there are basically inspired from Nihal Prakash, which I found out later. It's Guruji's Jivani depicted in fresco painting. So it's funny how a physical Asthan led me back to a literary source, because from there we used the mural paintings, and we thought, well, what are we going to do with this? Initially I thought, okay, we'll use Bhai Gurdas Ji's Var to give some of the history, and then I thought, actually, this isn't. Bhai Gurdas Ji's Var is in a very sankep, brief manner. And we were talking, we said, well, how can we make this a bit more expansive? Because we also felt, okay, sort of English resources for Guruji's history are lacking, especially in modern day English. You get a lot of Shakespearean type Victorian English tracts which most people can't engage with these days. So that's how we then led to a Nihal Prakash translation. So I hadn't actually thought about it until now, until you just mentioned it, that it went from actually built Asthan with artwork leading back to the literary source to discover the history. So that will link into how we consider the Asthans, but yeah, you can continue.
Yeah, and if you take it then back to the Poti itself, then like if you think Kavi Ji was writing a Poti, that Poti in itself wouldn't have had the sort of impact it had if it wasn't for the Gatha tradition. That Gatha tradition then shaped like a sort of collective psyche, which meant that there was like a sort of feeling that there should be these sorts of paintings inside of Asthans. Baba Atal Ji's Asthan is one which happens to be preserved, but there are if you document like the writing of Shri Nihal Prakash, Suraj Parkash, and then the actual commencing of some of these like wall painting projects, you can probably see that there's a correlation happening there. That Kavi Ji's work with the pen led to work with the brush, and a whole sort of tradition emerged after that. So it was thinking in this sort of way that, you know, I felt sort of dissatisfied as being in like a box of, I'm only looking at the Poti manuscript, doing this preservation, and that's it. And then I sort of felt that to truly preserve the Virsa which these Potis encompass, we have to pay attention towards the Asthans. And the idea of developing an organisation or a charity, anything like that, it was really through this sort of like this feeling that, okay, let's look at these paintings a little bit more. Risham Singh in particular noticed that there had been sort of like sort of changes in these paintings over time, which initially didn't fully make sense until through talking to a few friends, managed to get in contact with the actual sort of team who did the preservation work on these frescoes, and then it became sort of more clear that what had sort of happened was there had been these original sort of paintings which had over time undergone some damage, which had over paintings, and the Saki text has been sort of developed and sort of expanded, slightly altered in some ways as well. And then when this restoration team did work on at the site, when they were cleaning sort of later layers, they revealed this earlier layer which was sort of damaged. And what you sort of see now, I think there's definitely like more work to be done there to educate Sangha so they can understand, you know, the different layers that they're seeing, because what they're seeing is a sort of is a mixture at present. and therefore it was that experience of sort of research basically which led us to think that okay, we need to do more to develop the seva of asthans into something which is driven by some kind of philosophy, and therefore through conversation with Virasati Asthan Seva, this organisation, I would say, was born out of that really.
Even this idea of palimpsest, of something painted over, becomes very topical. Looking at the various layers of Sikh tradition, how conservation is something that's ongoing and is really the responsibility of every subsequent generation to carry the spark of Baba Nanak forward. On your website, on the Siddhant page, you conceptualize an asthan as the place building relics, memories, and code of conduct through whose combined power a related Gursikh historical figure or event comes to mind. How does this understanding, rather than through concepts such as pilgrimage or tourism, shape your approach to this seva that you're undertaking?
So I think we adopted a broad definition because we thought, well, when we use the word asthan, we use it quite broadly. Sometimes people use it just to refer to a building, but when you go to India and you see the historical sites, you see that many asthans aren't just physical buildings, they have other items associated with it. It could be like a tree where Guru Sahib or some other historical figure has sat, and the tree gains significance because of that. You have sakhis, for example, where Guru Angad Dev Ji climbs the tree to shake the kikkar down because Guru Nanak asks them to, and you get mitta coming down. So you get all of these sorts of sakhis associated with asthans where it's not just a building, which in many cases has come a lot later. You get wells and other sort of monuments as a way. So we wanted to adopt a definition that encompassed all of that. And Jasdeep's already talking about how the Pothi as one particular aspect sometimes features. So there are certain gurdwara that are associated with a manuscript or a saroop in particular. I remember a couple of years ago I visited a gurdwara in Kapurgarh, which is associated with by Nihal Singh, who was an agarji of Guru Gobind Singh. And there's an Aad and Dasam Hatlik saroop there, as well as a rabab. So rababs are hard to find from the Puratan times. There's one in Mandi that I can remember, and there was one there and it had animal scenes painted. So certain asthan have all this different aspect of heritage to it. So from the outset, in terms of defining what are we doing seva of, we wanted to adopt the broader definition and expand that definition now into the Sangat. Coming to your point about sort of pilgrimage versus tourism versus what we're trying to sort of conceptualize the asthan as, I think what I was saying before and what Jvala was saying, that is the Gurus themselves understood the place of history in invoking the spirit of action and change. Maharaj says, Babaniya kahaniya put saput karen. And if you look at the traditional Sampradaya explanation of that Shabad, what they actually say is Babaniya refers to the stories of Guru Nanak. And Guru Angad Dev Ji told them, and in telling them, put saput karen, that amongst the children then they become saput, they become they become Gurmukh. So Maharaj has given that Siksha already, and we don't have to look too far in other aspects of Sikh tradition. Tar Diwar, for example, where did that come from and why it came in? That came in, that's a different discussion, but it falls into this as well, because the Gurus understood that in order to inspire people to get up, change themselves and change the world, they need inspiration. And that inspiration then needs to be safeguarded somehow. It needs to have a physical sort of space where it's safeguarded, protected and nurtured. And in the Gursikh tradition, we believe that place to be the asthan. Sikhi talks a lot about, introspection. And you come across like shabads like Tirat Naam, Rajao Tirat Naam hai. And people often use that to say, well, there's no concept of pilgrimage in Sikhi. And I would say, yes, that's right, when we consider pilgrimage as a means to salvation, which other faith traditions sometimes do. Visit this X number of places that have been consecrated, and you will then receive some reward, be it a better life or salvation, whatever. Yeah, and of course, in Sikhi, it's never a case of go here and you'll receive enlightenment. It's not that. But what it is that the Gurus themselves consecrated places, made them meeting points, made them bastions of knowledge of Gurmat. And when you go to an Asthan, then we feel that by remembering the person who was there, so we've been talking about Kavi Santokh Singh, it brings to life everything that happened there. What event happened there? Who was there? We can relate to it. We get supercharged by the energy we feel there. We get inspired and we come away. You see, even in Sikh history, what is it that people that have, the oppressors or people who have taken an antagonistic approach to Sikhs, what is it that they've done? The first thing they've done to try and antagonize us is destroy our worship places, our historical places. And that's why Harmandir Sahib has been destroyed so many times, starting with the Afghans, right? Because they viewed that place as a source of knowledge, inspiration, the epicenter of the tradition. And in a way, we perceive every Asthan in that manner, because each Asthan springs out of some history that is common to the Sikh people as a whole. Where does that come in then with Kavi Santokh Singh, who we started this from? And in fact, it is apt that his Asthan is one of the ones that we're beginning with, because suddenly you look across the border into Pakistan and you see many derelict Gurdwara that have been left behind, but their memory remains. The people who were there, who safeguarded the memory, are no longer there. They got forced across the border. But we can remap the history because of Kavi Santokh Singh's literary works. They're playing a very mutual and beneficial role. So like I was saying earlier, I saw the building, I saw the artwork, it inspired me to look at the history. I went back to the history and then I went back to the artwork. So you're constantly going to and fro, and they serve to protect one another and grow one another. So in terms of tourism, pilgrimage, the Asthan is a living, breathing manifestation of Gurmat, in our opinion. And that's why they need to be looked after, because they preserve a common history of a people. And if we don't preserve that history, then you lose the history that's associated with that place. And you can see now many people have done some excellent work, like Amardeep Singh and other people have gone into Pakistan and made documentaries and documented history that's not even 50, 100 years ago, like the Havelis and things. And you realize that without those physical buildings, what markers would there have been to remind you that those things happened there? How do you contextualize what's written in the physical world without a physical marker?
Will you comment on Haveli Kavi Santokh Singh, in particular, how it exemplifies this conception of an Asthan in a very capacious, a very holistic sense that your charity is conserving?
Yeah, so Kavi Santokh Singh Ji's Haveli it's a beautiful place, because if you were to walk past that and not recognise what had happened there, it could be like another sort of building in the street. There are other sort of historic Havelis in Getal as well. But knowing who walked around there, and it takes a bit of imagination to do this sometimes, but I would say because there are physical sort of like remains there are much of the physical structure still exists. It doesn't take that much imagination. You can easily imagine Kavi Santokh Singh Ji walking around there. This is something which I think is quite important. That your eyes see something historic, and then your brain starts. It travels there. When we talk about wanting to have the darshan of our gurus or darshan of Guru Sikhs from the past, or like Sant Mahapurukhs, in a sense we are trying to travel to the past. What we're wanting to see is something which was in the past. It's a sort of time travel. And when you see historical nishaniya, which can translate as relics, historical sort of physical remains, historic walls, it's much easier for your brain to do that process and actually feel like you're going back there. And if it wasn't for that sort of Asthan, for the Haveli existing, Kavi Santokh Singh, in my imagination, would be much more sort of abstract. This is something recently when had a sort of was very fortunate to travel to Lahore last year and visited Gurdwara Dera Sahib. And Gurdwara Dera Sahib, unfortunately, as with many other Asthans, a large proportion of the original structure doesn't remain, or a historic structure doesn't remain, but a small portion does. The small portion which does is very powerful when you go there, because prior to that, when I would have heard Katha or someone talking about the Shahidi of Guru Arjan Dev Ji, it was much more abstract compared to being able to go there and see it. And so in a sense, preserving asthans is not something which is just, okay, it's interesting and historical. It's actually very important for Sikh Siddhant to flourish. Otherwise, these aspects of our itihas, they become much more sort of like distant. And therefore this desire this feeling to want to have darshan, it then becomes much more difficult in a way. So we do need that. With Kavi Santokh Singh Ji's Haveli, listening to Gyani Sher Singh, who is someone who's done an extensive amount of katha of Kavi Santokh Singh Ji's works, and their sort of experience of walking around the rooms and thinking that this seems like the sort of place where a Kavi would have been walking up and down and reciting, and Likadis were writing for them, which is itself interesting, because sometimes you can, perhaps in like paintings and portraits and images, we can sometimes think that the Kavi is someone who is with the pen in hand, but actually their observation was that in this particular room of the Haveli, this is where probably Kavi Ji was walking up and down, and Likadis were writing for them, because the pace of the Kavita recitation was probably so high, it was not feasible for them to be doing the writing themselves. And generally, this is something, I mean, the concept of like an amanuensis, like someone who is accompanying you to write, is something which is like well established in global, you could say, literary traditions. And it was nice to see that was happening sort of there.
We know this from Kavi Singh as well, is that where he was reciting this, Santokh Singh would walk around and he would have this little kind of stick there. And according to what meter they were reciting, whether it's a chopai or savaiya or kabit, etc., he would be tapping that stick and kind of building that beat, and he'd be reciting it that way. And then his Lakadis would be writing. And between him and the Lakadis, there was also a little parda there, a little sheet covering it. It was really interesting that he wanted to be in this kind of space where he was just totally by himself. He had the Lakadis there, the scribes there, but you see this in production in the West as well sometimes. They will make sure everybody's out of the sound room, right? To give the artist that kind of sense of he's just with himself as he's reciting it. So we know this from Kavi Singh interviewing people who were there, who had memory of kind of what was happening in the Haveli. But yeah, it's so brilliant to have seen photos of that area that Sher Singh, Gyani Sher Singh took, and just Sleep Singh you got a hold of. So yeah, it's a brilliant project.
Kavi Singh actually notes that it's just an interesting snippet I read the other day. He actually interviewed Kavi Ji's granddaughter. So that's how we know the Haveli is Kavi Santokh Singh's, because she identified it for him. So a lot of the detail came from direct descendants of the Kavi, because there's no plaque there that says this was Kavi Santokh Singh's Haveli. His own family identified it, and Kavi Singh scribed it down and then took a photograph that we have from the 1920s, I think.
And he mentioned he wanted to purchase it as well.
Yes, he did.
That he tried to purchase the Haveli. Think about this, 100 years ago he was trying to purchase it, and now Gyani Sher Singh has done it and purchased it and now given it back to the community.
Yeah.
So one could say that in an asthan, one has a past event that has physical remains, but its eternal significance is something far more intangible than that which you're able to see, and it's that which is existentially of value for the Gursik. And in a way, what the Seva is doing is making sure that from the tangible remains, the intangible essence shines through as brightly as it can. I'd like to bring in visual artist Mandeep Singh. What are the different craft traditions that Virasati Asthan Seva is seeking to support as part of its conservation efforts?
So initially it would be like structural engineering, so that in itself is very much and would require an artisan approach. You're working with asthans or structures that are not built in the modern way, right? Even such, you can think of even the smallest sort of details of a structure of an asthan would be like windowsills or archways. These are built in a very specific way, and it all falls into a very homogeneous approach to what that structure was used for. when you look at domes and such, and we were discussing this earlier today, like domes add to the acoustics of the place, right? So even if the kirtan is done under a dome, there's a certain vibration that comes from it. So even these specific details add so much to an asthan. So when it comes to that, making sure the right materials are used is a very important facet, and that in itself can only be done by an artisan who knows how these structures were made. So we're very lucky to be in conversation and working with such artisans. And then you move on to other aspects. So you got frescoes, you got very much the visual sort of representation of manuscripts, and like what was mentioned before with Baba Dalai Gurdwara and such. You also have frescoes which don't depict anything, they're much more floral, and that adds to a sense of serenity when you're walking into that place as well. All of these sort of aspects fit into us being able to visualize how Kavi Santokh Singh Ji walked into this Haveli. If they step out, being able to walk in through the same darwaja that they had walked into, the doors, the carvings, all of this add to a sense of, is this what they were looking at when they walked in, and did it in any way have an impact on what they were writing throughout the day? So Resham Singh also mentioned that the definition of an asthan that we've kept is very broad, right? It doesn't just mean the structure, it could be the wells that were used, and I would go a step further and even say that gardens themselves are an aspect of conservation that needs to be looked into. Going even further than that, if we're looking at trees and such, it could be that those trees provided the very oxygen that allowed Kavi Santokh Ji to breathe and utter these words that they sort of penned down. So it's very deep in understanding our surroundings and the surroundings that such history took place. There's a almost hidden butterfly effect that we're unaware of, and it's up to the artisans that are very specific in these areas. The very park that we're sitting in now, like there's trees here that are probably older than most of those towns that we'll be working with, and that they're preserved so well. Yet when we unfortunately look at our history and we walk around Amritsar itself, we'll notice that many of the trees have been chopped down, or in some way the growth has been inhibited to make way for a building around it, a structure around it. What we're working with at Virasati Asthan Seva is to work with the surroundings that they're currently in, bringing it back to how it was. We're not changing anything in that sense. We're reviving what that building once was, and who knows what the butterfly effect from that will be. It could inspire further poets that are going to come ahead of us, maybe even after us. And when it comes to artisans, we can see that in our history, or let's say right now, a lot of asthans that are being repaired, or in a not so conservative approach, let's say, or for the benefit of the structure itself, is to make something completely new. And we can very easily attribute that to, unknowingly attribute that to lack of knowledge. However, with the help of this charity, we can very much say that there are artisans that exist that are able to produce levels of work just as the level of the time that the asthans themselves were built. Be it the materials that are used, the methods that are used. This is knowledge that hasn't been lost, it's been lost from the Panth. So what we're trying to do is bring that in and almost in the nicest way abuse that, right? We're trying to make the most of these artisans and carry that forward, be it a sort of, we're almost acting as patrons for the artisans in that sense, as well as hopefully engage people that didn't have an interest in this, or had an interest but didn't have an avenue to follow as a career path, to allow them to actually follow that as well, and then become the next custodians of the art that they'll be sort of contributing to in the future.
You'd spoken about poets. Do you think that visual artists as well are particular stakeholders in and beneficiaries of the conservation work that you're all engaged in?
I would say so, very much so. It's we can take the prime example of Gurdwara Baba Dal Rai. That in itself is visual representation of text that Mahakavi Santokh Singh Ji have written, and this can translate to not just structures as well. We can look at pothis. So we've got the Janam Saki pothiyan, we've got the B40 Janam Saki as well, which actually depicts Guru Nanak Dev Ji. It's adding to it's a visual aid to the text that are sort of contained within, and that in itself can, if done well, trigger something in someone's mind that may want to follow them without having to look at the text. So different aspects can trigger people in different ways. If you're looking at the manuscript, you might not even be able to sort of understand it visually, and we could talk about Kirtan in that way as well, right? You're not necessarily looking at the manuscript, but you're listening to what's contained within. So that in itself is triggering something within someone. So I think all these aspects, as an artist, especially visually for me, myself, I would say plays a key role in understanding what was once there and how we can sort of bring that back to life. We can even say that photographs are a form of visual art itself, and they will hopefully benefit us at Virasati Asthan Seva, especially when we're comparing. When we have a sort of tangible evidence of what this Asthan may have looked like, then we can work with the artisans to say, okay, this is how this looked at this point in time, and then we have something to work with. The teams that we are in conversation with have worked on the most incredible preservation projects and conservation projects, to the point where they're restructuring a full facade of a building that was dilapidated and build it back to its former glory based off of just a photograph. So these are the type of artisans that we work with. So in conclusion, I would say even the structure itself acts as a visual aid. That in itself is a visual art.
If I can add to that, sort of this thing about traditional skills is very important to consider, basically. So there's often like a feeling of like frustration if you ask people, are you happy with the way Gurdwara in Punjab generally? There's many which have been demolished, and you don't see so many historical traces. Many people say, it's not very good. They don't like it. They shouldn't be done this way. There's this feeling of frustration, but it doesn't always sort of fully, I would say, like grasp why the situation is like this, and that sort of frustration can sometimes result in like a feeling of bitterness, maybe sort of antipathy towards particular like groups who engage in this sort of activity of like renovation, you can say. Whereas actually, if you try to diagnose the problem, then I feel it's more useful. So one of the problems I see is that if you historical building practices, you can say, since the colonial period, late 19th century, early 20th century, probably since sort of like the development of sort of concrete and things like that, the actual sort of like the skills which are used in making traditional buildings, and I use tradition in a generic sense, so spanning the vast of pre-colonial era, that skill set gradually sort of went down and down and down and down. And it's not just in buildings. This was a much more sort of like wider sort of issue. It's the same reason why, if you were looking for someone to make a traditional saranda for you now, a saranda is the instrument, it's the same reason why it's difficult to find someone to make that. If you wanted to learn how to write a savaya now, it's very difficult to find someone to teach you. This sort of decline of traditional skills, it's all part and parcel of an overall trend. And when you see Asthans sort of going into a state of dilapidation and not having people who are skilled enough to work with them as they are and repair them, develop them, it's all part of this overall sort of problem. So then when you see that is the issue, then to sort of resolve that, it really involves finding people and places where these sort of skills are present. And then to bring them together so that something can be reborn. It all sort of makes sense when you think of it like in a very sort of naturalistic sort of way, where people who are engaged in sort of environmental conservation, they work with some habitats which have been in a very sort of like decimated state, soils which have been like intensively sort of farmed, with using heavily chemical based agriculture, very sort of like monoculture type systems. To turn that into something which is more diverse and organic and sustainable, it basically involves looking at the soil. You cannot just sort of like get a plant from here and there and place it in there and expect it to flourish. The actual soil has to be healthy. And if you see these asthans as sort of great trees, these great shelters under which other sort of forms of Sikh culture live and are established, the tree must exist in sort of a healthy soil. And this healthy soil must consist of sort of these diverse skills which themselves may not seem related to one another. The construction of a dabab and the construction of an arch may seem like completely independent things, but to the people who make them, they are very connected. Hence why many of these sort of architects and artists were polymaths. There are people who could do sort of things on a macro scale and a micro scale at the same time. Kavi Santokh Singh Ji, what they make as Suraj Parkash is, if you want to consider it itself, as an asthan. Guru Granth Sahib is an asthan, and even the language within Guru Granth Sahib, talking about things like mahalla, ankar, they can be perceived to be like this. It is an actual asthan which is being built. Gurbani itself talks about this, particularly like Karam Kali Ki Var, very famous composition. Nanak Raj Chalaya Sach Kod Satani Leave there Lehne Dhadun Chat Sir. That Guru Nanak Dev Ji established this asthan with the foundation of truth, and Bhai Lehana Ji placed this shot on top. So there's this idea that an asthan is actually something metaphysical as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say as well that in some ways that we find living out here in the West as well that there are many avenues of conservation, and if you think about it, for a society to thrive, it has to make the best of its natural surroundings, and it knows how to manipulate those surroundings to make things with longevity. With that said, then we have to sometimes think that because of the advent of colonialism and also Western building techniques, sometimes people say, oh yes, steel, concrete, yes, these are very withstanding materials that can last a long time, but they're not suited for that environment where they weren't ever nurtured. If you think, for example, even some of the architects you see across the Indian subcontinent, we couldn't even, with our modern brains, conceive of how those things were even built. Even if you consider Darbar Sahib being built in the midst of a water body, at that time, 400 to 500 years ago, it does boggle the mind, because to do that now, what would you need? How would you achieve it? So it makes the mind think there are traditional methods and ways of doing things that stand the test of time. Even the other day I was looking at frescoes online from the Wazir Khan Mosque in Lahore, because it has a massive wall. It's the longest painted wall in the world, I think. It's got frescoes. Those frescoes have been there for 400 to 500 years, painted on an outside wall, and if you think subject to the elements, rain, monsoon, for 400 to 500 years, the fact that there's even a trace of colour on them suggests that whoever put them there had a very deep knowledge of what they were doing, because why would you paint something that wouldn't last more than a year, right? We all paint our houses, you were painting your house last week, things don't last. So we have to delve back into traditional methods, because traditional methods evolved out of an environment over periods of time and withstood the tests of time there and are well suited. And the other thing I would say as well about why an asthan should stay the way it was built, you have two reasons for that. Number one, the way our ancestors, our forefathers built things often reflects the philosophy they were building them for. Darbar Sahib's 4 doorways, the fact that you have to go Nima to get in, the fact that it's open to all, the fact that the Akal Takht is orientated towards Delhi. There's thought in all process. It's not just, let me just erect a building. But there's something I forgot to say that earlier, and I want to put it in there before I forget again, that I came across a document some time back that Gyani Thakur Singh, who was a great scholar in the early sort of 20th century, and was a military granthi and was part of the Panj Pyare who baptized Sant Attar Singh Mastwana. So He wrote many tracks like the Shahid Bilas Baba Deep Singh. He found a handwritten Hukamnama in the collection of the Sodhis of Anandpur, so the descendants of Guru Gobind Singh Ji, handwritten in the same style that Jvala Singh so beautifully puts up on his Instagram, of Guru Gobind Singh Ji sort of khas patra kende hai, like that? Yeah, that's it. And it says specifically, there's 10 hukams to Banda Singh Bahadur in this Hukamnama. It says, and one of them is, जाके सरहंद नू साहिबजादे लई यादगारी बनाओ. Yadgari is the word used in the Hukamnama. Something that preserves the yad, memory. So if you want to put it in one word, the Asthan is memory. Memory of something physical, something metaphysical, something philosophical, something artistic. Memory of all those things, as you were saying. So the Asthan is that place where those things are nurture and grow and flourish. And if we don't have Asthan, then we have nothing in that sense, in the physical plane, right? Because ultimately we're here in this physical Garum Bhumi, and the Asthans are our tools to move through it.
Final section of our conversation, fairly short order. I'd like to come to this particular project, Haveli Kavi Santokh Singh, and begin by asking how it is that Virasati Asthan Seva became involved in this particular seva.
So it was really just through the speaking with Gyani Sher Singh Ji. It was all sort of developed. So Gyani Sher Singh Ji is a sort of well-established Gyani from the Buddha Hang tradition, and also encompassing many other sort of Sampradaya traditions as well. And they, through their life, have done Katha of Suraj Parkash Katha, Nanak Prakash Katha, I think probably like many multiple times. And as Jvala Singh Ji mentioned, this desire within the Sikh Panth of obtaining the Haveli with access for the Panth has been around since the time of Bhai Veer Singh, who really did want to purchase it. And between Bhai Veer Singh Ji, which is the 1920s, you can say, and the sort of present decade, a number of other sort of scholars have gone there. I think Gandhi Sant Singh Maskeen is known to have visited the Haveli, and it's been a sort of thing which has been floating in the imagination of Gyanis, that there's this Haveli which we would really like to bring into the Panth. And through great difficulty, in like I would say over the course of probably the last decade, Gyani Sher Singh developed this charitable trust, which is known as Kavi Santokh Singh Ji Churamani Trust, who got together enough funds nationally, then within India, and probably also internationally to some degree as well, and through a long sort of difficult process managed to purchase this Haveli again, and actually in segments, because part of it was purchased later as well. And ever since the trust, Kavi Santokh Singh Ji Trust, took over the care of the Haveli, at the outset what they wanted to do was to really preserve it in a more sort of holistic sense. And this is the reason why, even though it's been purchased since, I don't know what the exact year was, but it's been a number of years, they were very careful not to just straight away start doing some work there, knocking walls down and rebuilding or changing things in a major sort of way. They really just left it as it was, and they started this conversation of looking for specialists, and slowly we got to know the Asthan, got to know Gyani Sher Singh Ji and the trust, and we developed conversations with various different professionals within the field of conservation architecture, and through this sort of process of conversation realized that what we sort of want to do is not just keep it as a archaeological site which is left as a ruin, which is, there are a number of sites within India which are left in that sort of state where they're not used or accessed. What we wanted to do was really sort of preserve it in the most holistic sense, to bring it, give it a new function. It's not the residence of the family of Kavi Santokh Singh Ji anymore, but it's the residence of their memory, and to enable that memory to survive, the physical Asthan needs a lot of help.
What are the primary structural issues that it's currently facing?
So, I mean, some of the issues it faces, I would say they are a result of changes which have gone on in the environment, but also just general instability. So, Kavi Santokh Singh Ji's family lived in that Haveli up until the 1840s. It's not. I don't have the sort of full periodization, but in the decade following it's the 1840s, 1850s. In the decades that followed that, as we understand, the Kavi Santokh Singh Ji themselves, they passed away in 1843, I believe, and shortly after that, during that time period, the Kettle region came under the control of the East India Company, and what was formerly like a stronghold of, you can say, a Sikh intellectual stronghold, it basically that whole structure basically collapsed. And when Kavi Santokh Singh Ji themselves passed on, their family didn't remain there for very long. Through various circumstances, their sons were compelled to sell on the Haveli, and after that, because the memory of Kavi Ji then went, the later inhabitants did not have that sort of memory, and some portions of the structure went into a state of decline, basically. There's one entire wing which is completely missing. It's not clear exactly when that was lost. But what remains now is primarily the facade, the front side of the building. But when you walk through the front gates, the front doors, after that, what you see is a shell, basically. And the sort of issues it faces, one of the biggest ones is this issue of moisture sort of rising upwards, because the Haveli was originally built on this higher platform, which is higher than the surrounding area. But since its historic sort of original existence and now, the surrounding urban environment has built up and up and up, and sort of surrounding buildings and the surrounding road is now higher, and there hasn't sort of been attention to the drainage of water, and so many of the walls have this issue of rising damp, which causes the mortar to decay, basically, and weaken. Then I think most buildings, provided they are lived in and have like regular upkeep, will sustain some kind of sort of order. But the families who had been living there had mostly moved out, and only a small portion was actually lived in. So most of the structure does not actually have any type of like roof on it anymore. And once the roof starts to give way, this water ingress, it causes major issues, because the walls themselves, they're very substantial, but they are made of two components. The sort of outer layer, which is mud brick and lime mortar. Then there's inner layer, which is mud brick and mud mortar. The mud bricks themselves, these are like they're very beautiful bricks to behold, because the conservation architect Gurmeet Rao really commented how, like, you can see these bricks are made of very good quality river silt, or like clay, which is from the soil, and the bricks themselves are largely, you can see, in good condition, but the mortar which is within them is really is decaying, and so there are major issues. The loss of this one entire wing has meant that this building, which was previously a sort of U shape and was balanced, is now in a state of imbalance. So the front facade is not supported on one entire side. There are sort of there are major things like that which are happening. The conservation architects, they currently are producing a very, very detailed report, something which is known as a DPR, a detailed planning report, and it involves, it's not just one brain, it involves a number of brains coming together. So engineers are looking at cracks which are running through the building. They're looking at the condition of particular like bricks and seeing are they able to like withstand the force? Which areas need reconstruction using the original materials but sort of reconstructing them again? Which areas can be held together using metal supports? All these sorts of things are being looked at. So it's a structure which is in a very fragile state. I mean, when I went last November, there were some areas which we really could not set foot into because we were not sure if the
I could
bricks
ask
were completely.
Resham Singh about some of the experts that you're bringing in for the conservation work, more generally the importance of bringing in their expertise for bringing this project responsibly to the next stages of its implementation.
So it's quite interesting. Everything obviously is Guruppa, how this journey has unfolded. I just mentioned the Baba Talarai stuff, and he was the one who actually managed to contact the people who were involved with the restoration there. And this was probably 3 years ago now. And from there, our contacts with these conservation architects have grown. So as this idea sort of blossomed, we were able to nurture that connection. But one of the big things Jasip was talking about earlier, this feeling of frustration and bitterness, where you look at something, you think, I don't know how to rectify this situation. Living out here in the West, you see buildings that are thousands of years old. On the weekend I was in a church that's 900 years old and standing perfectly beautifully. We haven't yet seen on a wide scale a resurgence of that sort of approach to our stance. And in fact, most of the, actually some of the local, Gyani Dikka Singh, who's the sort of project manager under Gyani Sher Singh, who's on site, he was saying to us on a call the other day that a lot of the local Sangat quite frequently come up to him and say, why don't you just knock this down and build something new? Because that's what they know. I mean, and the way I liken it, I mean, I'm a medic, so I can't get away from the examples, but 100 years ago, if somebody got gangrene, they would just chop something off. If you got sepsis, you would just chop the limb and that's it, right? There were no antibiotics. You wouldn't do that now, right? So our job is to educate the Sangat that actually we can take these buildings that look like they're about to fall over, stabilize them, preserve them, reconstruct them, and they'll be perfectly good for future use. But the way to do that is you need expert advice.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add there though is whilst what we are trying to do is bring in experts, it's not that the care of Asthans is something which is new. The care of Virasa is not something new. This feeling that some Sikh within Sangat may have, like, why don't you just knock the thing down and build it again? I would say is actually like a new thing. If you look at the vast majority of Virasat which exists, which our Panth has, take historic Poti Sahib for example. I would say you would be hard pressed to find a historic Poti Sahib which does not have some kind of evidence of historic repair, be it complete rebinding or be it sort of patch repairs which have been done. There is always evidence of repair. Asthans are the same. Historic Asthans, when you look at them, take Baba Atalai's Asthan. It itself is the result of a number of decades of work. As I understand, the original structure wasn't 9 stories high. It was a smaller thing. Before that, it was probably going to be something smaller. And if you look at many Asthans, this sort of study hasn't been done, but there are elements which are very, very early. And which components are very, very early, which are later, requires a study. Shri Kal Takht Sahib is a good example where it is known that the Tada Sahib, the actual Takht itself, which according to Itihas was built by Bhai Gurdas Ji and Baba Buddha Ji, that component has remained, and the structure around it has developed over time. So there is this parampara of Sambhal. Even the seva of Shri Darbar Sahib, the copper gilded panels which was done, the Sonali seva done during the time of Gyani Sant Singh Ji, is in a way, if you understand it, was a form of repair and preservation, because it is known, it hasn't been fully documented, but it is known that the copper relief panels, the depictions which they show, reflect earlier wall paintings which are underneath. And this sort of encasing in gold as a form of preservation is something which is, you can see it in many traditions across Asia. There are a number of Buddhist asthans where there is like a gilded statue of Mahatma Buddha, and internally there's something which is earlier. In Christian sort of history, these reliquaries, these relic holding devices were often containing something earlier but encased in gold. And I sort of look at the Soni de Seva as a form of restoration, which took place, and using traditional skills. And so when we say we're trying to educate Sangat, in a way we are trying to reconnect Sangat with an earlier form of Sambhal, where using materials and methods which are like closer to the original to keep something standing. Yes, in a way now what we do have is what is, you can say, new, is what we are dealing with now in the Bant is a situation where if it was a forest, there are very few trees left. Some of the trees which are left are in a region which is inaccessible, and so we're not lucky enough to be in a situation where there are a number of trees where we can happily live there. So thinking of it in terms of asthans, because what we have which survives is so small in number, the extent to which we feel that we should preserve them in a more intact way is much more compelling.
Totally.
That is part of the reason why if someone says, you're keeping these structures standing, which possibly in the 19th century they would have deconstructed and reconstructed another way. Well, the fact is that now we have so much less which remains, that to preserve our memory, it is so much more important to keep whatever remains alive.
And just by way of conclusion, I'd like to ask what Virasati Asthan Seva's role in this project is, and ultimately what the vision for the Haveli is going forward.
So essentially we see ourselves as really just a group of like-minded people trying to preserve our history, and the way we do that is by literally dialogue. So the whole process, as we've outlined to you, has been about talking to the relevant stakeholders, bringing in the relevant expertise, trying to get to a common place where all the interested parties can make a decision that works for the benefit of our wider community. So we've picked a stance where there's dire need of our support, where they might be a little bit off the beaten track. That Kavi Santokh Singh Haveli isn't our only project. We have another one lined up in Amritsar, the Baba Bikrama Singh Bedi Gurdwara in Amritsar, which we can talk about later. But essentially this whole last few years has been really building the contacts, building rapport, also sort of building confidence, building confidence with Gani Sher, saying that we're serious about this. We're not like a bunch of time wasters or anything. We want to put our skin in the game a little bit. What can we do sitting here? As you mentioned in the introduction, we're registered in England and Wales. That's because that's where we live. But we see ourselves very much as being able to facilitate dialogue, and then using the Bant's global khajana, its treasury, its resources, to really fuel the conservation effort. So alongside that, then, in terms of sort of the future, already things have started. We see the organisation being able to sort of fuel the revival of traditional art forms. We've already been speaking to some artists who are engaged in traditional art forms, trying to create a forum to revive, Sikh-based art fields and things, and also then fuel research as well. So as Jasdeep was saying, there are many aspects of Sikh architecture artwork that are not well studied compared to other traditions like the Mughal or the wider Indic tradition. So we see this as not just a springboard for saving one tree, or using Jasdeep's analogy. We see it as, well, actually this could revive that Sambhal culture, not just for the Asthan but for traditional art form, and fuel research as well going forward. So we think the charity's role is going to grow and grow and grow, not just from just now starting dialogue, but actually now really facilitating knowledge acquisition and knowledge sharing about traditional Sikh art forms. And sort of, in some ways, our history is the youngest in modern religious senses as the youngest, major faith. But if you think about what the Sikhs achieved in the period of turbulence that we've, half our history has been turbulent because of the instability in the geopolitical area with the constant invasions and things. If you think about what our ancestors achieved in the space of 50, 60 years, where the missiles come to power and the Ranjit Singh consolidates it before the British, it's quite remarkable. It's serious, and it's only 150 years ago. So if we can revive those art forms, then there's no telling what we as a united community might be able to sort of reinvigorate in ourselves, because clearly the creative aspects are there, right? With the evidence is there.
Yeah, and what we see as sort of like trickles which are like taking place in different areas. Some people are looking at wall paintings with an interest, people are looking at various like historic styles with an interest. We want to bring these trickles together into a sort of confluence, and even things which may seem unrelated. So for example, talking about historic styles, like one of the things is looking at a building and a town and being able to talk about it, and to talk about it in a way which connects with the Boli, the language of our ancestors. So it was looking at one thing I remember recently, that just the front side of the Kavi Santokh Singh Ji Haveli, speaking to one of the conservation architects, Gurmeet Raji, and she put us in contact with architects in Lahore who have this traditional vocabulary, and then through that we were able to realise that Acha Punjabi de vich they would be talking about things like, this is what would be a pointed arch, and noki dart hegiya. If it's a floriated arch, vangadiyan wali dart hegiya. If it's like a little niche for like a lamp, it's ale hegiya. These sorts of things are quite important. Imagine talking about kirtan, and you're talking about without being able to use words like sadanda, without being able to use words like rag. If everything was talking about this is so and so mode and this is stringed instrument, our culture, our way of thinking, we would really be divorced from our ancestors. So when we want to do this sort of research, it's not sort of like all book based, or it's not sort of abstract. It's really being able to like look at an Asthan and at an ordinary level being able to see things and speak about them. Because if you start to see things, you start to appreciate them. If you appreciate them, you feel sad when they are gone. And this is what we were really trying to sort of like develop and build on an everyday level. So education is going to be a big part of what we do. Connecting with these different voices who all are speaking about the same thing but are quite distant from one another is important. I mean, just this conversation here, some of us are from the UK, but many of us are from overseas. We're trying to bring these sort of voices together, so that the voice becomes stronger.
Oh, this is all tremendously heartening. In a way, the Asthan is the natural point of convergence for the Gursikh life world. They are direct emanations of the Gurus walking on earth and leaving a tangible imprint. And the more that we can take what remains of them and have them shine in their full glory again, we can expect to see great art, Mahakavya, Kirtan emanating from these. So it's really with the spirit of Seva, spirit of Sambhal, that we're gathered here to discuss this, and really wish the best for this project to flourish and to help rekindle the Gursikh imaginary. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.